This is the third part. We can skip talking about me. Well, I do look almost as baby-faced as this picture from 7 years ago. I do need to get my picture updated, which I'll be working on. But I work with Carlos. I do Power BI consulting. I do Pluralsight authoring, and I'm the third podcast host. Looks like I got the animations messed up somehow, but we'll be talking about licensing very briefly. We'll be talking about some of the basics with Power BI visuals. And then if time permits, and if it's necessary, we'll have another super simple demo of adding visuals and deploying and that sort of thing. So let's jump into it. So question for folks, and I don't expect an actual answer, but who here rides the bus, or who here used to ride the bus, right? Because we're all kind of stuck at home these days. And the reason I ask that is I've got a question. What's cheaper, a bus or a bus pass? And that seems like a no-brainer, right? Like a bus pass is like $2 and a bus is like $200,000 or something like that. But the answer is that really it depends. It depends on how many people there are and for how long you want to be able to service those people in getting to and fro, so to speak. And when it comes to Power BI, we've got two types of licensing. That's a lot like either buying a bus ticket or buying a bus. So the default is user-based licensing. So you pay per user, and that's like buying a bus pass. With Power BI, the default option is to spend $10 to $20 per user per month, depending on what level you get it at. And that's every month, and that's per user. And the benefit of that is that it scales up really easily because you can start with 5 people, see if they like it, and continue to grow from there. On the other hand, you have capacity-based licensing. And this is like buying a bus. And the way that this works is you assign content to capacity. So this could either be Power BI report server, and you put the reports on the server, or it's Power BI Premium, and you're putting the reports in Power BI workspaces that have been assigned to premium capacity. And the real short version of this is capacity licensing starts to make sense at somewhere between 250 to 500 users. When you have fewer than that, the cost value proposition just isn't quite there. So what are our options for user-based licenses? Well, first we have the free license, and this is pretty much useless. You can use it in conjunction with premium capacity to consume content, but if you want to be able to share content with other people in a way that's secure, the free license is pretty much useless. Because you can learn Power BI with a free license, you can make content, you can even share it, but you have to use publish to web, which makes the underlying data accessible to the whole world. So if it's your daughter's lemonade stand and you're doing some analytics, awesome, perfect. But if it's financial data and you're under Sarbanes-Oxley, maybe not so good. The next user-based license is Power BI Pro, and this provides the majority of the features, right? So it's kind of where things started, and most of the stuff you're going to need works with Power BI Pro. It's also included in Office 365 E5. Then you have Premium per user, which is fairly new, and it's Pro plus some premium capacity features. And Premium per user broke my analogy of the bus versus the bus pass, because it's like riding alone in first class. And specifically what I mean is that premium per users, or PPU users, I don't know, it's like ATM machine, right? They can make content and they can consume content, but other people can't consume the content they produce, right? So it's kind of like being, I think, what is it, an AB blood type, right? You're a universal receiver, but you're a very bad donor, right? So it's a tongue twister. Premium per user really makes sense when you have a small number of users, but you need some of those features in Power BI Premium, such as more refreshes, larger data models, all those sorts of things. So next we have capacity-based licenses. And so there's two main options for this, or four if you get into subtypes. So the first one is Power BI Report Server, and that's basically SQL Server reporting services plus some Power BI features. And then you have Power BI Premium, and there's 3 tiers within that. The A tier is spun up in Azure and is designed for application embedding. So if you've got some third-party software, this is ideal. You've got the EM tier, which is ideal for Office 365 embedding. You don't get the full PowerBI.com experience, but it's a lot cheaper than the next one, which is the P tier, which gives you the entire full PowerBI.com experience for all of your users. And there's no specific limit to how many users you have. It's like that bus. You can try to shove twice the occupancy. You might have some people sitting on other people's laps and stuff, but you could do it. It might smell a bit, but you can do it. And so finally, with all that, you've got this pricing, right? So I've got some plus symbols there because it can go really, really expensive. But you're going to have to talk to Microsoft directly. But generally speaking, the EM tier starts at $625 per month, but it's going to be somewhat limited. The P tier starts at $5,000 per month. And so if you divide these by 10, you can get an idea of why I say that it's somewhere around 250 to 500 users where it starts to make sense. Finally, there's one last gotcha. You have to license the bus driver too. And to me, this is super goofy. With Power BI Premium or even Power BI Report Server, you're licensing the capacity, but that doesn't give you the right to make and deploy the content, which is so absurd, right? You're paying $5,000 per month, but you still need any report creators to have Power BI Pro. So you're actually paying $5,010 per month or $5,100 a month. It's utterly absurd. So some quick takeaways on the licensing part. Power BI Pro is cheap. It provides the majority of features. Power BI Premium per user is a weird blend. And you really only want to get capacity licensing in one of 3 scenarios. You've got a large number of users, and so it becomes cost efficient. You've got large data models or very specific requirements around refreshes or some of the advanced administrative capabilities with XMLA endpoints. Or you're heavily invested in Ssrs or can't go to the cloud and you want to do Power BI Report Server. So that's all the licensing bit, and we'll have time for questions because I know that's very high level, but nobody gets excited about licensing, so I try to keep it quick. So how do we get started? How do we actually start making some visualizations? Well, here is a screenshot from a simple sample report based on the work we did the last time. And so what you're looking at is a portion of Power BI Desktop, and it's broken into a couple of different panes or sections. First are the visuals. There's easily 30 visuals out of the box. There's a bunch of community visuals. And so what you're generally going to be doing is the first thing is you pick the visual you want. Do I want a bar chart, a line chart, a card, a table? You're going to click that, and then over on the canvas, it'll appear. But it's not going to have anything in it. And so what you have to do is from your tables, from all the data modeling you did before, you're going to pick out the fields. And they're going to show up here in the settings area. And so this is where you specify what fields show up as your bars, as your legend. You might have stuff for tooltips. They've got support for small multiples. And then actually, if we go back a little bit, I don't know if you can see it that well, but there's at the very top, there's 3 icons. So we're at the field wells icon or the values wells icon. But the next one over is a paintbrush, a roller. And that's where you can set all the settings for the visual. So you can set font and size and colors and all that stuff. And then the third one is a magnifying glass over a bar chart or a line chart. And that's where you can add some very simple analytics. So you can add trend lines. You can add some basic forecasting, nothing too impressive, but still useful to have. And then finally, we have the filters pane. And the filters pane allows you to filter on 3 levels. You can have filters applied just to the visual, you can have filters applied just to the page, and you can have filters applied to the entire report. And this is really like one of the great user experiences when it comes to Power BI. Because you can decide, okay, I want to hide some of those visualizations, or I want to hide some of those filters. I want to lock them. I want to let the user be able to make changes to them. And so a lot of the interactivity comes from filters and working with those. So let's go a little bit deeper. I like to take an iterate and expand approach whenever I'm doing report development in Power BI. And this is where it kind of shines, because you can start with the raw data, just bring the data over, right? Same thing you might do in Excel, just get the data. And then with DAX, you can start adding some business meaning, right? You can say, okay, I've got these fields, but what does it mean? What were our sales year over year? Then you can start adding in some interaction, where if I click on a bar over here, it filters everything else, or I can drill down or drill through. And then finally, you can add context. So you can have rich tooltips that tell you, well, why were sales down during that period? We're doing some work for a flight management company, and you look at the lines, and if you were in a cryogenic stasis chamber for the past 2 years, you might wonder, well, why did flights dip right around March last year? And you can have tooltips that can give you some idea of what was going on there, or at least what the numbers looked like in more detail. So let's walk through this with examples. First, we've got the raw data, right? And so here, I'm just pulling in information from the database onto the screen. And if you're doing this, honestly, if this is all you're doing, Excel is way prettier, way easier. And SQL Server Reporting Services is just going to give you so much more control over the output, how it looks. So if this is all you're doing, I really wouldn't use Power BI. That's not what it's meant for. But next, you can add meaning, right? So you can define a calculated column like you see above, where we say, okay, if we didn't have line total saved and calculated ahead of time, we can say it's quantity times price times 1 minus the discount, right? And again, you can do this in Excel pretty easily. You can do it to a certain degree in SQL Server Reporting Services, but it gets a little bit more difficult. And again, these first 2 layers of the pyramid, not really what I'd want to use Power BI for. Where it gets more interesting is when we start to add interactions. So here what I've done is I've clicked on a bar in a bar chart, and you can see that the other bars have been faded out. And you can see over on the right, all of the colors for those transactions are silver because it's cross-filtering. I clicked on a bar, it filters over. And we have a couple of different options in Power BI for these types of interactions. So we've got filters. So you saw the filter pane and how the user can say, I want to look at a specific date range, I want to look at a certain category. And they can decide, okay, is that going to apply to just the page, the whole report? Do I want to save my bookmarks for these filters, which is a really cool feature because you can have a bunch of different views of the same report and you can jump straight to them. Maybe you have a certain view for a period of time or a region or department or what have you. Next are cross filters. So cross filters is what we see on the page here. I click on one part of a report and it's going to filter everything else on the page, and you can edit those interactions. So you can make it so that some visuals don't update other visuals. And then finally, we can drill down. So that means within, say, a bar chart, maybe we're looking at region like Latin America, and then we want to narrow it down to all of the countries within that region. And so you can enable that so then the user just double clicks on a bar and they can see that level of detail. And these are all super simple to implement. Some of them, like cross filters, are implemented automatically. And then finally, at the top of that little pyramid is adding context. And there's 2 really great ways to do that. So the first that we can see here are rich tooltips, right? So the whole idea is that we hover over this bar chart and we can have any other visual that we could have on the report show up. And in fact, it's basically a different report page. It's just really, really small. And so we can hover over blue and see, oh, well, until 2013, we didn't sell anything that was blue. And we can see it's weird that we have these spiky sales. Now, the reason we have the spiky sales is because this is from the AdventureWorks database, which is a sample database, and so it's artificial data. But you can really add in-place contextual information through rich tooltips. And for me, when I'm working with customers, this is usually where the wow factor finally comes in, right? A lot of the other stuff we talked about, they expect. Now, the cross-filtering is the first thing we're like, oh, this can do stuff that maybe I can't do as easily with Excel. But the rich tooltips are where they see the light bulb goes on, and they can see that, oh, I can really not only display descriptive information, but I can dig in and find out the why for certain things. The other thing that we can do is drill throughs. So the whole idea is I could right click on that blue product bar and select drill through, and I could have it take me to another page where everything's filtered to that blue color. And so again, this is really useful for figuring out, well, why were sales weird, or what's going on with this customer? Why is it they're behind on their invoices, what have you? So this all boils down in my mind to kind of an iterative process. So you get the data, you identify some kind of need. And with Power BI, you can start small. You can just license a few users. You can focus on just displaying the raw data, adding a little bit of business meaning, and then you can iterate and go through these 4 layers of this pyramid and keep adding more meaning, more context, more detail. You deploy, you share, and you just build out as you go. And so this has been, in my mind, one of the success stories of Power BI is that it supports that self-service and organic growth kind of model. Now, as you can imagine, that self-service and organic growth doesn't always scale, but Power BI has ways in powerbi.com to promote certain reports, certain data sets, to mark them as certified, all this kind of stuff. So I just wanted to show you super, super simple, real quick, what it looks like to be working with this, right? So here we have from before, we've got our line total and discounted sales. And what I can do is I could take this field swell, and we've got the silliest names here for stuff, but I can take my subcategories, and right now it's just giving me a list, and I could click on it or what have you. But what I could do is I could change that to the much dreaded pie chart, and then I could say, where's my line total? Add that as the value. And we'll make that bigger. I know it's super, super tiny. But now I could say, okay, our biggest product is road bikes. And if I click on it, we can see that it filters everything else. And I can edit these interactions, right? So what I could do, I can edit interactions. And I can say, you know what? It's such a small portion. The fact that it grays it out doesn't really work. Let's filter it. And so now if I click on road bikes, it'll just change to show just that data, right? And another thing that we could do is, instead of doing this, we could have that interactivity with that rich tooltip, right? And so I could say, okay, this is going to be tooltip size. This is product categories, and I can take this, put it over there, and it's mad because it's huge. I advise shrinking it down before copying it over, but here we are. And so I can go ahead and we'll get rid of that title that's taking up a lot of space. And I could even add a I should be able to add a top end filter. Let's see. Can I change this to be Maybe. Or maybe it's going to be difficult because is that one a measure? Let's see if we can do this. All right, it's not working with me today, but that is okay. So we've made that a tooltip. So now what I should be able to do is I go to settings and I should be able to say, okay, I want a tooltip and I want to use, what did I miss? Sorry, I apologize about this. Page information. It's annoying because you have to like set it in 3 places. You have to change the size, you have to say this is a tooltip, and then on the other thing, you have to say you want to use it as a tooltip. But now what we should be able to do is we can say, all right, I want to use categories. And so now I can delete that. And now if I hover over, I get this little mini report. And so I can see this contextual information and it's filtered to whatever I'm looking at. So, all right, cool. So that's kind of like a high level what actually, no, I want to publish. Let's publish this report. So we'll save it and we pick a workspace. And hopefully it's going to behave. Oh, there we go. So Power BI Quick Start. And I'm going to replace what we published up there before. So let's go to powerbi.com, or is it going to be smart enough to take me there? Let's see. Okay, now since I opened it, smart enough. So now it's taken us here. And again, we get the same kind of experience. And what we can do is we can share this with other people, right? So we can share the specific report. We can add them to the workspace. Let's see. We can add people to the specific workspace. And even we can say that, okay, I want to create an app. So an app is a packaged bundle. And so it's got a name and it can have a picture and all this kind of stuff. And you can control what shows up on the little sidebar and all these sorts of things. What does it want? Cool stuff. And what's nice is you can say, okay, if you're in this distribution group, you just get access to it. And people can view and consume this without you having to worry about them messing things up or seeing reports that are still a work in progress. So let's go to the app. And so you can see over here on the left, we've got something that we published a while back, which was from Microsoft, and we've got our quick start report. And usually what you would do is you would hide the tooltip page so it doesn't show up. But that's basically the gist of it. Does anyone have any questions about any of this stuff? Oh, what are the automatic refresh capabilities of Power BI once uploaded to powerbi.com? Yeah, so that's a great question. So you're going to have to install something called a on-premises data gateway most of the time, unless your data is living in a cloud-ready source that Microsoft has access to, so Azure SQL Service or something like that. But what I can do is I can go here and I can go to this data set and I can schedule a refresh here, right? So I would need a data gateway, but once that's there, I can schedule a refresh. And so by default, you get 8 refreshes per day. So if you're doing during working hours, that's once per hour. That's not bad. If you pay for premium, it goes all the way up to 48 refreshes per day. And so that's basically every half hour throughout the entire day. So that is one of the benefits of Power BI Premium is that you can get a lot more data refreshes. But for really basic reports, 8 times a day works decently well. So thank you, Justin. It's a great question. All right. Does anyone else have any other questions? We've got plenty of time. I'm more than happy to answer them if there's anything.
Very good. Well,
Yeah.
so I know that we have some folks that are just getting started, or they're still fairly new to Power BI. Perhaps, excuse me. The question is, Do you have other, besides this wonderful webinar, Rich, has been
Sure.
helpful, right? What resources would you recommend that people might check out as they wanted to get more serious into this?
Oh yeah, no, that's a great question. So, a great starting point is on YouTube. There's the whole guy in a cube. Let me get that. Let me get a link. But Adam Saxton and Patrick LeBlanc have some really great stuff. Let's see, guy in
Yes,
the
and
cube.
they make some wonderful videos.
Yeah, no, I'm super jealous, but I know they put
Oh,
in
yeah.
the work. Let me
Yeah,
get that
making videos is hard.
in the chat.
It's super hard.
Yeah. Yeah, so they have some great stuff. There's quite a bit of content on YouTube in general. We call them the Italians, but Marco Russo and Alberto Ferrari have some of the best books and content when it comes to DAX, just in the whole entire market. I think Microsoft's still doing some of these dashboard in a day kind of things, but I haven't been super impressed with those. So they're free and they're useful, but a lot of it is like just going through this like recipe, and it's very heavy on like the configuration and how stuff looks. Trying to think, I definitely recommend. It's not exciting, but following along with the Microsoft Power BI blog is a really good way to keep up with all the updates and changes.
Updates.
Yeah, because
That is one of
they're
the
due stuff every month.
challenges. Yeah, with
Oh
Power
my
BI,
goodness.
it's always changing, right?
Yeah. But no, there's some good books. There's a lot of good stuff on YouTube, and then keeping up with the blog, that all helps. But I think honestly, it's one of those things that it really helps to get your hands dirty, because a lot of it doesn't click until you try to figure out how like the hip bone connects to the leg bone kind of thing, with just the fact that you have these like 3 or 4 different tools, right? And where they fit together. So I definitely recommend like just grab some data and try to make a report and make it ugly, use your pie charts. And then you'll have a much better idea of like, okay, where's my gaps, right?
And so to that, right? So there was some feedback that folks would like to do hands-on pieces. So I'm not sure how well that's going to work over a webinar type environment, but we can certainly look at trying to do that.
So there was a question by Anand about how to do subversioning. Yeah, so the source control story for Power BI isn't particularly great. I mean, it's gotten better. My recommendation first and foremost is to separate the data set from the layout, right? So I heavily recommend having a report for your shared data set and having other reports based off of that, because then the files for the actual just layout portion are much, much smaller. So we've done that with customer work. There's some stuff with Azure DevOps. There's some integrations. There's some stuff with development pipelines. But I don't think there's any great source control story. So I think, unfortunately, in most cases, you're going to be storing zip files. Basically, that's what PBIX files are. They're zip files. But if you can either use parameters to clear out the data, right, to change the data source to something empty, or you can separate out the data source from the layout, then you're not storing, 1/4 of a gigabyte files, but instead you're storing much smaller files, and so it's not as big of an issue. But there are some tools out there. Some I think I forget. I think Reza makes some like Power BI helper. I think the Italians have something similar for DAX where you can pull out some of the code. But a lot of times what you're going to be looking at is having it so you have a dev environment, a production environment, and use data source parameters so that you can use the same report, deploy it to both, have different environmental parameters, so it's pointing at different data sources, and separate out that data set from the layout portion, and so then it becomes much easier to keep up with changes. Got a couple questions here from, no, you're welcome. Got a couple questions here from David. So let's see. Yeah, so like it's about, when does it make sense with Power BI report server and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, it's interesting. Power BI report server makes sense anywhere that SQL Server report server made sense, and you want some Power BI capabilities, right? Like it's the same business case by and large. And in fact, it's the same bits under the hood, right? Like when I was doing a course ages ago about deploying Power BI, I included Power BI report server, and I was looking at the source code for the website, and there was a little flag. It was like report server, yes, no, or something like that. And if you would change it, it would have different branding for whether it was Power BI report server or SQL Server reporting services. But a lot of that use case is the same, right? So you have a heavy investment in SSRS already. You want to be able to use those reports. You're stuck on premises. You have much more of a comfort with server-based licensing, right? So you don't want to get into the whole subscription kind of model, although that has its own issues. Because Power BI report server isn't cheap. You're looking at basically you're looking at enterprise edition cores of SQL Server, which are, you get enough of those, you can buy a house.
Right.
Or you're looking at Power BI Premium anyway, and then they just include it.
That's the challenge, right? So the SMBs, right? They may not feel comfortable in the cloud.
Yeah, they're like standard edition.
But the sticker price for having a local environment is you're paying enterprise prices at that point. And
Yeah.
so it's definitely not something that you can try, right?
Yeah. I honestly, if you're an SMB, I would in that kind of situation, I would look a lot at either just sharing PBIX files, right? So Power BI Desktop, it's not designed for report consumption, but it works fine, right? So you may have a slightly worse user experience, but it's free. Or leaning more on Excel, because we talked about in the previous sessions, the data cleansing and data modeling capabilities are in Excel as well as Power Query and Power Pivot. So there's that piece. And then this question is SSRS likely to become a thing of the past? And the short answer is no. They just filed off all the serial numbers and changed the name. And I mean that 100% seriously, because if you look at the DAX versus multidimensional piece for SQL Server analysis services, I 100% believe that multidimensional expressions and the old way of modeling with SSAS is going to be a thing of the past. I haven't seen any significant updates. I haven't seen new significant features. I haven't seen a lot of support in the cloud, just like it's on life support. That is not the case with SSRS. What they've done is they've renamed it to paginated reports, but it's the same tooling, it's the same development, it's the same software, but now you can run it in Power BI Premium, right? And the reason that I think that's going to stick around is I'm trying to think of like a PG way of saying this, but yeah, I know. Power BI's print capabilities is garbage, right? It's not meant for that, right? Like literally, it's an interactive tool. It's designed for interactive reporting. And so the idea of I'm going to take this interactive tool and then just take a static view of it and put it on a piece of paper, it's not meant for that. You can export to PowerPoint, you can export to PDF, but it's basically taking a screenshot. And so in my mind, there's an entire class of reports, operational reports is what I call them, that there's always going to be a need for. These are the things that help run your business and go on piece of paper. So in a prior life, I've written invoices out of SSRS because we had specific needs, right? We wanted to show the work that we've done and we wanted to be able to hide stuff and all that. Right. I've done work orders, technician schedule sheets, all this stuff that would just be a nightmare to do in Power BI, right? So I don't see it going away. I think Microsoft was like, we're going to try to kill it off, and then they got too much customer blowback, is my guess, right? This is pure speculation, but it really seemed like they tried to de-emphasize SSRS. They stopped talking about it. They did a huge update in 2016 to make it HTML5 and make it more modern. and to be able to bring in the Power BI report server kind of stuff, but it didn't seem like they were doing a lot otherwise. I mean, heck, we had like the lost decade between 2005 and 2016 where there wasn't a ton going on. But you know, I've been hearing more and more about paginated reports, and they added it in Power BI Premium. So no, as long as it's part of Power BI Premium, it's here to stay, 100%. But great question. Let's see. I have a PBIX with 10 to 15 report pages. Am I following best practice of report design? How many pages per PBIX do you recommend, and how many visuals per page? Great question. So I hate giving the IT answer of it depends, but it depends, right? So I personally, yeah, right. Well, like personally, if it's starting to get to be more than a dozen, then I start to get a little bit worried. So 10 to 15 is probably fine. But what I like to do is I like to carve it out based on functional area, right? Like I like to carve it out as like, here's reports for accounting, here's reports for HR, here's reports for operations, that sort of thing. And it can be fine to have a number of pages there. What you have to be aware of is kind of the cognitive load as the person's trying to find whatever reports they need, whatever pages they need. But in my experience, when we do customer work and we have a report like that, what tends to be the case is the first like 5 pages are everyday stuff that they want to see all the time. And then the rest are usually like super niche kind of things, right? It's, oh, I want to see the detail for the general ledger, or I want to know like what were our shipping costs per sale, or all this very specific kind of stuff. And so if you're not impeding the user's ability to get to where they want, then I don't think it's a huge issue. But whenever you have to like, you've got like 20 of them and you have to scroll over twice, then you have a problem. But again, usually the 80-20 rule seems to apply. You know, 20% of the pages are doing 80% of the work. And so if you order them based on usage and then suborder them based on sub-content area, right, in a way that's logical, I don't see that as being an issue, right?
I also wonder if there are ways like the tooltip. It seems that the tooltip, while there's a little bit of magic, or you have to hold your nose just right, or your head,
sure,
to get it to work. Sometimes we've seen the tooltips kind of negate the need for additional pages.
Yeah, exactly. Or you can do drill through pages and then hide them from the user, right?
Sure.
So they can drill through and they can get that extra detail. That's what I like to do. I like to have dense contextual information, so I can get that level of detail, but I'm not asking the user to pick from this menu of all these different things to go to. Now, in terms of visuals, my personal preference is I don't like to have more than 8 to 10 visuals on a page tops, and it's less visual clutter, although that's important, but it's performance, right? Because we've had issues where like there's 20 visuals on a page and every line, every visual, every single thing slows it down. And we had a customer, where they're like, oh, well, we're going to make the visual that we're basically going to make custom visuals. And it was like 9 subcomponents, right? And in PowerPoint, that's fine, right? If you just like, okay, I'm going to group these objects together. But there's a tool in Power BI called the Performance Analyzer, and you can see, okay, each of these things is taking rendering time. But the way that I usually tend to do the reports, tend to lay them out, is I take an approach where the sidebar or the top bar is these card visuals that give me my top line information that I need. And then I might have some charts or some other things that I can click on and filter stuff. And then finally, I'll have a table or some other detail dense piece of information. And so that allows people to scan like you would a website and get what they need most quickly, but then they can click on stuff or they can filter things and go down. But usually my priorities when it comes to number of visuals is performance first and then usability and accessibility, because generally the good performance will force you to limit more strongly anyway, right? But that's a great question. And yeah, I definitely agree, David. I think SSRS I think it's here to stay, they just keep calling it paginated reports because apparently SQL Server reporting services is a bad word now. So it's kind of funny. But great question, Anand. Great question from before, David. I appreciate it.
So we've got one from Peter, and Peter, you may need to help us out a little bit because I'm not sure that I understand it. It's about Q&A. Do you actually turn it on or disable?
No, I know what Peter means. So
okay, very good.
So I've just never had a circumstance where I've found it useful. Right now, maybe that's some bias on my part, but what he's talking about is Power BI has the capabilities for you to do like Google type searches. Yeah. And like, I don't know, it seems cool. It's a great little checkbox for the tool, but it just doesn't match with my mental model of how people work with reports. If you are going to turn it on, what I recommend is first preceding it with specific questions, which you can do. And then it's been a while since I've looked at it, but I believe you can also specify synonyms for things, right? So that's my recommendation with the Q&A is if you think you're going to use it, make sure you've really given some thought to cleaning out your data model, having synonyms, making the names vibe or make sense with with the tooling. But you know, it's never been that way for me. I've always been interacting with what I would call power users, right? Like imagine, you know, like the Chris in accounting, they're doing their job today. They know what they need and they have something that's partially meeting those needs, maybe in a dysfunctional way. And so usually they're not saying, okay, I want to explore this data like some sort of museum, but instead it's like, I need to know how to get to the bathroom. Like, forgive my analogy, but like I have a pressing need. Where is this thing, right? And so usually it's just a situation where they know what they want. They may not know how the tool can meet that need, or they may not know how they want it to look or what the best practices are. But generally when we do work, like people are already doing something. And so it's so rare that we get to be able to be like, yeah, it's so rare that we can be like, all right, here's this greenfield project, here's this blank canvas. And now you can ask questions to see what's in the data. So I think it's a neat feature. It's just never matched with my experience interacting with customers.
And I will say, so I mean, Eugene mentioned it, but the idea that you have to match your columns to the words that they're going to search on can be a task, can be a chore, right?
Oh yeah,
on your system. So yeah, it's almost you have to be you have to know your users and what the vocabulary they're going to use, and then make sure that your your data model matches that, and can be cumbersome, right? That is can be tough to implement.
Yeah. So two other questions. Justin looks like we got a couple things. Getting people interacting. So Justin had a question about embedding Power BI reports into SharePoint Dynamics 365. Are there any pros cons to scaling this versus going to PowerBI.com to view the reports? I think if people are used to using Office 365, I think that's a fine way to do it, right? Like really, the big thing is it's a navigational piece, right? So I
more culture.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Like if you're successfully doing the whole SharePoint intranet thing, great. Now, again, you have to make sure that you've given some thought to discoverability and all that kind of stuff. But no, you're getting a lot of the same features. So I think that's a fine approach, and it's cheaper if you have 100 to 250 users, right? If you do it that way. So I think that makes a lot of sense. David had a question about the modeling data on the Vertipack engine. Folks with no data modeling skills take the Power BI modeling canvas tool to an extreme. Tips on how to keep front end, back end in proper lanes. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, my best thoughts there is to try and establish some rules of thumb and best practices and try to guide folks in that direction, especially if you can show them how that can improve performance and accessibility, right? And so what I mean.
No, so you'll forgive me. I have to
No,
laugh.
please.
I imagine that David is a consultant, right? Some of the questions that he's asked, and I'm like, David, this is a good problem for you, right? Because inevitably that means that they're going to be like, hey, this thing is broken, right?
Sure.
Can you fix it for me?
No, I mean, so usually when I'm trying to communicate this stuff, like when I talk about data modeling, I try to explain why, and I don't go overboard on the detail, but one of the things that I remember when I was learning about how to teach people stuff is the best way to sell aspirin is to give someone a headache, right? And so the picture I try to paint is that you can get a lot of usability and performance benefits from kind of a star schema, maybe a snowflake schema, where you've got your centralized transaction tables and you've got your lookup or reference or dimension tables around that. And it's a bunch of one-to-many relationships, right? And just explaining, hey, based on the fact that it's a columnar engine, you're going to get better performance if you have fewer columns. You're going to have better performance if it's hard for me to articulate this on the spot, but the way that you segregate out that data, you're going to have a better user experience, because when you do that star schema approach, you can make it abundantly clear to the user. Filters always flow downhill, right? They flow from the dimensions to the fact tables. And so it can be very clear that, okay, these tables are for adding stuff up. These tables are for filtering. And so, that's generally the way that I approach it. But sometimes it's a losing battle, right? Like, Carlos was talking about the consulting piece. We had a customer where they wanted all these tables, and they wanted like these aggregation tables at 3 different levels of aggregation. And we tried our best to explain, like, okay, here's the issues you're going to run into. But it's like, no, I want a cake that's like bright neon pink. And it's like, all right, sir, it's going to cost you, and it's going to taste weird, but here's what you get.
And inevitably, I think there as well is that, unfortunately, so you mentioned like the hands-on piece. The marketing is like, hey, look at all the visuals, right? But a lot of the work is going to be on that modeling, and unfortunately, you have to have the users have the experience of, oh gosh, I have to do all this back end stuff. I have to do the plumbing, right, to get that right.
Yeah, David says sometimes he doesn't always have the power to do some of the stuff when they have vendors or in-house staff. And yeah, I mean, a lot of times, again, like the being able to show up with receipts helps a lot, right? Like I've done that with SQL Server, where this was years ago when I was doing like health checks and stuff, and they were having weird performance spikes. And man, when you can send to the vendor like a query execution plan and like the stats for it, and you can show, hey, we're getting these weird spikes because you don't have this index, it's amazing. And so, I would try to get comfortable with DAX Studio, the performance analyzer, all that kind of stuff. So some other questions. All right. Kevin, if you've got a question, put it in the Q&A. If it's just a general comment, just put it in the chats. I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A right now.
Yeah. So can I jump in there, right?
Yeah, please.
So he's looking at, can I tune page order filtering per user?
Can I tune page order filtering per user?
I think that's going back to like the tabs, right? You mentioned like, hey, you look at the usage of the reports.
Yeah, I would need more context for that. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Eric asks, when will Microsoft implement versioning on reports and data sets? I'm more optimistic than I was 2 years ago.
Oh.
I'll say that because, so
starting to mature a little bit, right? In terms
what is it? John Kursky did a presentation for you about like data ops and that kind of stuff, and they've finally been adding integrations with Azure DevOps, right? And that's huge. So I feel like we're getting close. But I don't know when they're ever going to move away from that, what's basically a zip folder file format, right? But I feel like we're a lot closer than I was expecting us to get, is I guess what I'll what I'll say.
And I should say, right, so our the other MVP that we're working with, they haven't announced anything, so we have no news to share there in terms of like, right, it's on the roadmap or anything. So
yeah, so some more questions from Kevin. Can I embed fully functional Excel sheets? I forget, honestly. Like I don't think there's a visual for that. I know you can upload Excel sheets, but I think the functionality is fairly limited. But I honestly, it's been years since I've had to look in that. And then he's got a question: can I store a small amount of data with the web page? Yeah, I know they've done some embedded Excel, but I haven't seen a visual for it. Can I store a small amount of data with the web page so that it does not slow down with 12 static visuals? You can certainly store data in the Power BI report. You can just enter data. Something that honestly, if you want to have some of that information and it's static, set a background image, right? Because it's just rendering the single image. It's not rendering a bunch of HTML objects. And so you can have a lot of visual information on your reports without slowing down performance significantly. So that's something to consider. But you can do with Power BI, you can do enter data and have embedded tables, and they store pretty well. It's whenever like you have, when you're talking about like 20 to 50 like visual items on the screen, like I'm not talking about like a single table. I mean, like you've got lines and you've got cards and all this kind of stuff. That's when I tend to see some performance degradation. So cool.
Let's see. So Microsoft, Peter asked in the chat, Peter, Microsoft is spending a lot of resources on mobile. Do your clients really run their business from their phone? So run their business might be a
right. That's
statement.
What's the thing? It's called like a leading question or begging the. No, it's the old version of begging the question, right? Sure. Not the modern. It means raising the question, but whenever the question implies the answer, right? You know what? I think it's more it's marginal value, right? Like you think about, we're in this bring your own device modern era. You think about how people are busy, they're traveling, they're in meetings, all this kind of stuff. And if you can get access to a C-suite executive, the information that they want in between meetings or super quickly, like that's a big deal. So no, I don't think people are running their business on just mobile reports. But I think that, I don't know, you'd be surprised how many people are using iPads and mobile devices in their phones, and how access to that information can be really helpful if you're in a meeting, right, or you've got a lot of there's a hierarchy of reports, and at the bottom are these purely operational ones, and then you've got analytical where you're digging in, and a lot of times you've got these kind of daily heartbeat reports at the top, where I think it's Stephen Few talks about it, where it provides situational awareness, right? I just want to check every day and see if the Titanic's going to hit the iceberg. Are we going to be okay? And so mobile stuff is awesome for that. Like, I just want to see, we had an iceberg today? No, we're good. Right? And so I think there's a demand for it.
I think of it like email, right? So like I want to be able to stay up to date on my phone, but I'm not going to be, pounding out the long form,
yeah, the work-life balance stuff with that is terrible. That's the world we're in, right? Like, I'm so glad that my phone will say sent from Android, because then people, like, culturally, they know that I'm not like writing out a novella,
Right.
So yeah, I think I'll put it this way. If I had to pick between like Q&A features or someone was asking about chats, I'm not sure exactly what they meant, but like the question and answer feature versus mobile, I'll take mobile support every single time, right? If we had some sort of boxing match between Power BI features.
No question.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Luther, right? We don't want you to drown. So if you get into that predicament, we'll make sure we get you. So it sounds like, just some basic, hey, how do I connect the data, right? Kind of go through some of those steps. So something that we'll take a peek at in the future and make that available. We just made you think a little bit more fully about how we do that, right, in a virtual setting.
Yeah.
Thank you for your questions.
Yeah,
Again,
definitely.
if there's other things you think that we should be talking about, right, let us know. I think that's it, Eugene.
Cool. All right. Well, it has been a pleasure, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day.
SQL Data Partners.